Hi, everyone. This is Carmen Sanchez from OSEP, and we're going to start this conversation about discipline with the Office of Civil Rights and the Office of Special Education Programs. Next slide. In order to make this recording best possible, we ask that everybody who's not speaking turn both off your camera and mute your line. So if you could turn off your cameras, that would be really wonderful. If you could, during the course of this, raise your hand, I will call on people as their hands were raised in order to provide some comments. Please also feel free to type any messages, any chat in the message space too. Please note that this presentation is being recorded. However, it's not going to be made public. It's being recorded for purposes of review by the Office of Civil Rights and also OSEP, but it will not be made public. And if you have a problem with being recording, then this is the time to get off the call. And it's important for you to know that this is being recorded. And you see the official notice here on the slide in front of you. So before I turn it over to ask the questions, I want to introduce my colleagues on the call from OSEP is Yolanda Lusain and Tara Crushane, and also David Cantrell, who's acting OSEP director. And from OCR, we have Dwayne Scott. But first, let me turn it over to David to introduce himself and talk a little bit about today's session.
Thank you, Carmen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for carving out some time to participate. We really value the listening sessions that the department engages in, and the topic of discipline is a really important one. So thank you once again, and I'm very much looking forward to today's conversation and hearing what you have to share with us. And it's also exciting that we're partnering with our Office of Civil Rights as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dwayne Scott. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, David. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon. Like I've been introduced, my name is Dwayne Scott. I'm a staff attorney with the Office of Civil Rights. It's my honor and privilege to be here with you all today, particularly when we get to partner with OSEP, but also to hear feedback and participate in this listening session on the very important topic of discipline. I look forward to hearing your comments, and I will turn it back over to Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Dwayne. Next slide. And again, I want to also thank you all for taking the time to be on this call. We know that this is either the first week, second week, in some places the third week of a new school year. This is a very, very, very busy time for the parent centers. So knowing that you're on this call means a lot, because I know that you're heavily involved in responding to families and responding to their questions. So I sent out ahead these 4 large topics that we would like to hear from you about. And the 4 large questions are: how are disciplinary practices and positive behavioral supports used in virtual learning? What disparities, if any, do families experience, and how discipline practices and positive behavioral supports are implemented for students with disabilities? How do resource officers and other staff interact with students with disabilities who exhibit challenging behaviors? And also, how do they interact with their families? And then how do schools ensure access to a free and appropriate public education for students with challenging behaviors? So I'm not necessarily going to go through these one by one. I think we could just start the conversation with whoever would like to talk first. And then if you could raise your hand, and then I'll call on you and you can unmute your phone. I know this is not a shy bunch, so. Let's see. Nope. Would anybody like to write something possibly in the chat space? Okay, Bonnie, can you unmute yourself? Bonnie Dunham from New Hampshire Parents Center.
Yes, we've had some calls from families whose children are experiencing disciplinary responses to behaviors while they're doing virtual learning. But the bigger issue is parents' concerns about when their children return to school, having lost all of those opportunities for social interaction and forgetting how do you behave in a group setting with more structure like a school is than virtual learning. So I think that we're likely to see a huge increase in the number of questions that we receive in the stressors that parents have related to disciplinary issues.
Okay, great. Liliana Diaz-Pedrosa, would you like to unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. I am calling in from New York, from Advocates for Children of New York City. We are not seeing positive behavioral supports provided in virtual learning. We're seeing removal of due process and protections. So for example, muting of students as an exclusionary practice for speaking out of turn, or involuntary removal from in-person to remote learning without notice. And it seems that Black students are disproportionately impacted and students with disabilities are disproportionately impacted. And so there's urgent need for OSEP and OCR to issue best practices for school districts. I have a lot more to say about that.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So one of the things that could be helpful is to revise the Dear Colleague letter that the US DOE sent, issued, and strengthen it with more examples and current data, and make that information accessible to school districts and families. I'm hoping that we do not go back to virtual learning, that this is the year that transitions back into in-person instruction. But even then, to strengthen the idea of whole student learning, so looking at trauma, looking at the history of the student, discouraging zero tolerance practices more explicitly, perhaps, and more guidance around trauma sensitive practices as well. I guess I'll chime in on other questions for now, but I think that's our feedback just on the piece that deals with positive behavioral supports used in virtual learning.
Thank you, Liliana. Mary Jacob.
Thank you, Carmen. In Louisiana, one of the things we're seeing is students that are being expelled for having their camera on like they're supposed to be, but there's things in the background that would be inappropriate for school. It may be a weapon of some sort, or the student may be wearing a shirt that has something inappropriate on it. And they're not taking any consideration into the fact that it's, you know, we do a lot of hunting in Louisiana, so it's kind of common to have maybe a gun case behind you, and if that's where the parent sets up the desk for the child, because that's where they have space. So we are definitely seeing that happening, and we're seeing it definitely disproportionately, because we've seen two cases for sure where white children that have had weapons behind them, it was kind of written off as, well, that's just daddy's hunting rifles, versus a Black child that had a gun on the desk close by him, that was a thug that was going to go out and cause problems to people, basically, is what their attitude was. They used that exact word to me. So I think we definitely need to have some guidance from OCR on how discipline like that would be handled, if it would be, you know, that would be absolutely a suspendable case, or expulsion if they were at school. But when they're in their home, does that make it the same?
Good points. And I also see in the from Iowa and DC, they also spoke to the question of unilaterally moving students into virtual environments, virtual learning too, if they exhibit behavior problems. Susan Henderson from Dredif in California.
Hi, everybody. And it was okay. Did I need to stick with the virtual learning, or can I respond to any
No,
of
you can answer you can respond to any of them.
Okay, so I just wanted to say here two different things that we've been recently got from families. So disparities that families experience and how discipline practices and BPS are implemented. So recently we heard from a family just this week that their child's having behavior issues at school. The mom was called, and it appears that the child, whatever what was with I don't know what the specific behaviors were, but the child was then locked in a room for 2 hours and had been screaming the entire time. And the parent is very distraught. And this is a family of color. And, I don't think that's a unique experience. So that's how that's being implemented. Not very well. And then we have a district here who we've been getting a lot of data on. And so kids with IEPs especially spend the least, are like they're not in a general ed classroom. The minute they have any kind of behavioral issues, IEP is called by the school and they end up in segregated classrooms. There's a really high, the numbers of kids of color in those classrooms is pretty high. And the same is true for the time they spend in a general education classroom. It's really low, and we've got statistics on that. So pretty much the way that this district is handling it is to segregate the kids right away.
And Susan, would you be able to share that, those statistics, send them on to me and Perry?
I think so, yeah.
Great, thank you. Helene Fallon?
Hi, Carmen. I just wanted to reiterate what Liliana was saying, and also Susan was basically just speaking to the fact that the behavior challenges are directly affecting the least restrictive environment. The kids that are exhibiting behaviors that in any way can be disruptive to the group, whether it be virtual or in person, are immediately being segregated. And it's extremely concerning. But when I read these questions, what came to mind for me was this is very consistent with the issues that we've had pre-COVID and pre-pandemic. And we very rarely do we see true functional behavioral assessments being done. We constantly see I want to quote unquote behavioral intervention plans that are created without any type of formal assessment. So I agree that some defined guidance and maybe some revised guidance on functional behavioral assessments and some of the evidence around positive behavior intervention strategies, if it came back out from the US DOE and OSEP. And as we know, each state is a little different. We are lucky here in New York, FBAs, there's some stringent regulation around it, but what actually occurs in the classroom, in the building, in the district is very different than what the guidance is directing. So thank you.
Okay. Do you have any statistics from the families you speak with, Helene, around that?
Carmen, I'll do a little research and I'll talk with Liliana about that because, we certainly are seeing, as I said, a tremendous amount of kids that are being segregated into separate settings due to behaviors. And we're doing a lot of work on LRE. So I will pull that and send that to you.
Okay, great. I don't see any other hands raised. I do see some comments in the chat space that I just want to sort of read out loud. Oh, Karen Price just raised her hand from Nevada. So Karen, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, this is Karen Price from Vermont. So actually a ways away from
Vermont. Yes, I'm sorry, Karen.
So what we've been seeing in the virtual environment is really a drop in any disciplinary concerns. We've had a few incidents of kids destroying their Chrome notebooks, and then what comes after that, who's going to pay for the Chromebook. So what we actually saw more of was that parents were frustrated that the school would not act when their kids refused to log on, that basically the school seemed to be fine with letting those kids go. So I would say that we were seeing the non-receipt of FAPE happening in that schools were not following up when kids refused to log on to the virtual environment. With the resource officers, during the virtual piece, that really wasn't happening. But I would say that before this, we had it probably very inconsistently happening with our school districts. Some school districts did a good job having the resource officers be, partners and seen in a positive way. And then in other school districts, it didn't work at all. And some of our school districts have gotten rid of the resource officers in their school districts entirely.
Okay, thank you. Mary Hartley from Peel. You may not be off mute yet. I don't see you on
My
mute.
apologies.
Yes, okay.
So school resource officers are still a huge issue, especially in our second largest school district, Pittsburgh Public Schools. We often see students being referred to outside justice systems when they are not in school, which is really detrimental to those children, especially not appearing on remote learning. But in fact, there was a recent report in Pittsburgh about the school discipline and the criminal justice system coming into play for students with disabilities, showing incredibly high rates of referrals for students with disabilities. I believe 5 times as much compared to 2 times in Philadelphia. Instead of school resource officers sort of being referring children for being late to school or not at school, or sending letters saying that children will be referred to the magistrate, the out and out conversation is all about making sure there's social work and supports for families of children who may be having difficulties at home, experiencing homelessness, having difficulty with computers, etc., instead of using these punishing methods for these same students.
Thank you. Deb Bellinger from Ripon in Rhode Island.
So what one of the things that I haven't heard used yet is we did get a few calls from families where truancy was threatened. In those cases where kids were not showing up for their Google Meets and any of their virtual education. In some cases, those were in writing. And in some cases, parents were just contacting us because they were afraid of truancy. There wasn't, I think initially there wasn't a lot of, they might have not, we were all learning at that time, including schools, but that was a big fear. Now they've got a child at home, and whether it was a 15-year-old or a 5-year-old, and who wasn't participating, and so there was that fear of truancy. But there were definitely districts that were threatening and that is the language that parents were using. So there were concerns around that also.
Thank you. And then Maria, I'm going to go a little bit out of order because Maria Blauer has been waiting in the chat to speak to the school resource officer. So Maria, if you want to go ahead and unmute your phone, and then I'll call on Liliana.
So just briefly, we do continue to see problems with student interactions with SROs, but also with school security staff. And I would agree with the comment that just popped up. They are reacting in a law enforcement capacity, and not in a therapeutic manner. So it continues to be an ongoing problem and a challenge in the district, although I think we're making progress. I also want to highlight what Deb just mentioned about parents feeling threatened with truancy. We saw a lot of that early on, and then it kind of settled down. But more recently, with a lot of discomfort in the parent community about a return to school, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in parents being worried about being referred for truancy. And also with parents, especially parents of students with disabilities, removing their children from school entirely and opting to homeschool. Our homeschool population's doubled in the district, and kids with disabilities, anecdotally, I think are overrepresented in that population. And I'm really worried about them. And I know that wasn't on your list, but I worry about them.
Thank you. Liliana Diaz-Pedrosa?
Hi again. I do speak a lot, but I will try to keep it short. I wanted to add on a little bit more about the school resource officers team. And in New York City schools rely on the New York City Police Department to provide school safety agents. And often they rely on their own law enforcement tactics to respond to students in emotional crisis. And what we found is that school staff might need help proactively managing students who are exhibiting behavioral challenges. Instead, the school safety officers often escalate the student behavior because they're addressing someone in crisis, as a law enforcement officer would typically do, which can lead to suspension and arrest, summons, or even emergency medical services transportation. The safety officers do not know a student's disability status or needs. There may be some barrier between what schools can inform the New York City Police Department about the specific students, there for protections, of course, and other rights, privacy rights that students may have. But then this might result in the safety officer not knowing how to de-escalate a situation and may instead step in to escalate a situation that could easily be just addressed by someone who is trained clinical and mental behavioral health professionals that can come in and help schools work on these issues. A simpler issue, of course, would be to eliminate police in schools and abandon the punishment-based strategies and provide more guidance around supportive and healing center models instead of what we're seeing, which is punishing the student. I'll stop at that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Liliana. Sally Baker for Family Connection.
Hey, thanks. I wanted to circle back a little bit on some of the disparities in the discipline practices. We see, or we get a lot of calls from families who have children who have, behavior challenges, and the school's response is to have that student put on an abbreviated day, an abbreviated schedule. So they're only there for a set number of hours for the day versus a full school day. And usually there's no talk around how to make up those extra hours that they're not getting, that their peers are getting instead. And so kind of looking through that lens, kind of like Helene was mentioning earlier, in that there's not a lot of talk of trying to do an FBA or try to look at the behaviors and what can we do instead, or creating behavior accommodations. And so there seems to be, I don't want to say pushback, but there seems to be some hesitation to actually have those FBAs created. And a lot of calls that we get from families who have students with challenging behaviors who are being called, parents are being called to pick them up. And there's no talk of like, this could be counted towards as a suspension. And so the parents don't, they call and then they don't know what an FBA is. No one's ever mentioned that to them. It's not even discussed as an option to support that student. So that's a lot of kind of what we hear, some of what we hear from our families around those disparities for their discipline. So thanks.
Thank you. Amy Holbert.
Hi, this is Amy Holbert, and I'm from Family Connection as well in South Carolina. Just wanted to mention a case around a special population that we worked with a family, a young girl who was in DSS, Department of Social Services, and was in foster care. And during the, in South Carolina, during the time when some school districts were allowing in person and some school districts were not, this young girl was moved from one school district where the IEP team had said that she needed in-person learning. And then when she was moved to another district, because she had not been in that district at the very beginning of the school year and couldn't say, hey, she qualifies for in-person, they would only offer her virtual. So I wanted to make sure that our special populations really had multiple types of barriers and continue to, but when kids are being moved from school district to school district with placement, it has, they're denied their access to to FAPE and to LRE and to actually any learning sometimes, or sometimes it's taken up to 3.5, 4 weeks to get the child into services. And then wanted to talk about the school resource officers. In South Carolina, we actually had an OCR complaint that everybody, across the nation in a particular school district. And as of today, I've received a new call where an SRO was called in the same school district on a 6-year-old with ASD, and the parents were not, they don't even know what happened. The child was spoken to by the school resource officer and the other child involved in an incident and the other children's parents. And so I don't even know what to say about SROs and 6-year-olds. Just there's no positive behavioral supports going on in that particular school. But anyway, so just really looking at how the use of school resource officers, as so many other folks on the call. And then as far as disparities, we did I know many of you across the nation did surveys, and we did a survey to our Latino population, and many of them, more of our Hispanic families actually had to send their kids to school because they could not understand how to teach them virtually because they couldn't read English and there was no assistance virtually for that. And so even when they felt like they were putting their children more at risk, even despite the concerns, because they felt like they weren't able to meet those challenges. And in our survey, the families also have been told many times that they would have to figure out, quote unquote, this is what a parent had written, they'd have to figure out how to get the help themselves, that they weren't, they received the information and they could send their child to school in person, regardless of the parents' concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Williers from Colorado.
Hi, Carmen and everyone. Thank you. I was just listening to everyone and just had to say just now, taking in how this could be such a potential opportunity for us as parent centers to kind of figure out solid solutions, for these ongoing issues that everyone is sharing here today, and a commonality for how we can engage law, and resource officers into the work of parent centers, and not just a training opportunity that's one outlet, but an opportunity to engage them in the work and understanding the power of inclusion and the power of the populations we're serving and how we bring them along. And, it's funny, I just came back from a back to school night as a parent for my son last night. And the first person I introduced myself to was the school resource officer and shared who my son was and the classroom he was in. And he knew him right away and different things, but just really feeling that power of relationships and connections and how we as parent centers can really find this now as, it's just, unfortunate we have this problem, but then really pivoting to the opportunity of solutions on how we can engage them more into our work. So I just wanted to kind of offer that lens as we kind of move forward together and figure out, how we pivot to some solutions for this.
Thank you, Michelle. Young Se from CETA in Queens.
Yes, hi, my name is Young Sabe. I'm sorry, I came a little late, so I'm not really sure if somebody already shared about the what happened in New York City before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, a lot of parents they wanted to have a behavioral support at home during remote learning because we have the large number of students who have a behavior intervention plan in our community, but certainly the school the resource were not reached to those families to implement those behavior intervention plan at home. Home being the educational environment, they definitely needed services or support, but they obviously did not get it. But I rather worry about what will happen when school opens, because particularly in our community, we have a couple of serious cases As you know, the New York City actually had a, I guess it's the lawsuit against the New York City Department because the high number of the EMS call for students who display the behavior issues or the challenges behavior during the school time. We have actually particular one students who were brought to the EMS and brought to the hospital emergency room because of his behavior. A person with intellectual disability doesn't speak in English much, parent doesn't speak in English much, and they simply put him in the ER, and they observed him for 48 hours and they released it. But it was quite an ordeal for the families and also for us. We're afraid those kind of practice going to be repeated after school is open. Many parents in our immigrant community are afraid of, the quote unquote behavior assessment, because a lot of people think that behavior assessment means that, the way the school removed their children to the inclusive classroom or in a larger classroom, they can access general education curriculums. So, we're hoping that there's some way that New York City school, New York State schools, to practice positive behavior plans or some way to help the families and the students access the support and improve the learning in the classroom, not using the behavior as a way to remove students from the general education curriculum.
Thank you, Youngse. I don't see anybody with their hands raised right now, but I'm wondering if some of you who have comments in the chat would like to raise your hand and speak to some of that directly. One of the things that came up in the chat is some concerns parents have about if their children would have difficulty keeping the masks on in actual in school settings, that they might then be having some sort of punitive result of that, even though they may be a student who, because of a disability, finds it difficult to keep the mask on. So that's one of the things that came up in the chat. And then, does anybody else want to speak to something? Jerry Clark from PAVE, I don't know if you wanted to speak to your comment about parent training being an underutilized option as a related service on the IEP.
Sure, I can just expand on that a little bit. When I talk to families, a lot of times it is due to behavior, and I'll just back up a little bit and say that pre-pandemic, as a parent training and information staff member, I would say about 80% of the calls that I got from families were related to behavior, referrals, suspensions, expulsions, and a lot of issues around the school calling to have the student go home day after day after day without any formal action being declared, reported, or taken. So not even called a suspension or an expulsion. So they're not being held accountable to the manifestation determination process, or even in some cases, the responsibilities under child fine to do an evaluation, because the school is reassuring, that's in giant air quotes, families that don't worry, there's, this is not a formal disciplinary action. The child's not being suspended or expelled. We just need them to go home. And that was happening a lot pre-pandemic. I think we're going to see a lot of that happening again in the fall. So I always try to teach parents that making it formal, making it reported is really important. But during the pandemic, the issue of parent training as a related service on the IEP came up a little bit because parents were being the ones who had to work on behavior so their students could access the learning, but they didn't have the tools. And so I would talk to families about this option to have parent training listed in the IEP as a related service. But a lot of the schools really didn't have a protocol for that. They understood that they could put it in the IEP, but they didn't really know how to make it meaningful. So I just think it would be really helpful to have some very specific guidance coming down from OSEP about parent training as a related service. And what does that mean? What does that look like? What's the school's responsibility? How do families navigate that?
Thank you. Any other comments? Julie Rycon from Association for Special Children and Families in New Jersey. Would you like to unmute?
Yes, I'm on. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
One of the common themes that I'm hearing with the families that we serve as Parent Center is that changes are being made in school districts, that the parents have not been involved in those changes. So what I want to share is there's an excellent book. It's called Uniquely Human. And in one of the chapters, it talks about how school personnel are the triggers for children's behaviors. Also, that the school personnel are triggering these behaviors, and then they seem to buy into it. Now, for all of the trainings that we all go through, there is the positive behavior supports, which I understand are put in place by a superintendent who comes into a district, but it's really not used. So a lot of the research, what I'm finding is a lot of the research-based positive reinforcers or understanding about are not utilized through the research-based information. And also here in New Jersey, in the areas that we cover, we see that the districts don't seem to be aware of all of the wonderful information that's coming from the federal government and the use of so many of the different types of positive behaviors that can be utilized in the way to start school off that's in a positive way. So there's so much negativity, and it might be good to address the states and say, listen, you have to use, here's how we can use some positive behaviors. And again, it's addressed in this book, Uniquely Human, that the teachers are the triggers. The administrators can be the triggers. All it takes is maybe simple explanations, patience with parents, keeping parents informed, transitioning students, maybe some of the students who were virtual, who were punished, or their camera or their speaker was turned off, were embarrassed because of their background, their living situation. So there's so much punishment. And we're talking about so much negativity that I don't think that people know how to use positive reinforcement appropriately. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Anyone else? I'm seeing a lot in the chat that behavior is one of the top questions that parents call you about. And again, people reinforcing the need to have additional guidance as to how parent training can be a related service for family. Susan Henderson from DREDF again.
Sure. Sorry, I was going through some of our intakes and notes, and I just noticed, so we had a parent of an 8-year-old son with autism who this month was the school moved to expel him because he ripped up his mask. We referred that to external legal services, but that's the kind of discipline. So no supports offered, just straight to expulsion.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Carla, I saw your hand raised, but then you put it down. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself.
I was just checking to see that my name showed up under my picture before I, yes. So, you know, in South Dakota, we're one of the states that has opened early. So our students actually returned to school. A lot of them had kind of an option of virtual or return to school, but a lot of kids returned to school last year. So another element to this that we have faced is we get a lot of calls this past year. We've gotten a lot of calls from families whose kids don't want to go back to school. And, you know, students who were not feeling successful, either academically or socially, found a reprieve from some of that when they were in some virtual type of format. And now that a lot of schools are saying we're not offering a virtual model anymore, you have to come back to school. We're getting calls from families who are, especially it seems like middle school age and older kids, they don't want to go back to school, and it's causing conflict at home, and parents are calling to say, how do we get our kids back into school? And so that's another element that is a rising concern for us here.
Thank you. And then Dawn McGrath wrote that we see no use of reduced day for behavior problems done boldly with the statement that there's just not enough staff. And some other folks echoed that they also seen that in their district. Okay. Any other comments? I don't see any other hands raised. I see some other comments in the chat. There's other issues that Dwayne and the office would like to hear from. So Dwayne, if you want to comment on that, ask those questions.
Sure, thanks, Carmen. So I wanted to just get some feedback and hear thoughts from the group with respect to, I think someone mentioned aspects of restraint and seclusion before, but I wanted some, just specific feedback on the experience that you all, or things that you've heard about with respect to restraint and seclusion, with respect to possibly chemical restraint or students who have been handcuffed, and then also timeouts that are used as disciplinary measures. Any information or feedback that you could give me on that would be helpful for us to just understand how those things are occurring in the schools.
So Jerry Clark from PAVE in Washington, you raised your hand.
I did. Thank you for the question. This comes up a lot with the families that I talk to, and just being very candid in this space, there is a lot of gaslighting of parents in the isolation and restraint process. There's a lot of manipulation of language. Oh, that's not seclusion. That's just our timeout space. And then we'll go deeper and ask questions like, well, was the student taken there because their behavior was dangerous to self or others? Well, yes, but it wasn't isolation because there's a window. Or it wasn't isolation because I was talking to the student, through the door or whatever, and the door wasn't locked, which of course is a legal requirement that the door not be locked, right? But they're saying that because the door wasn't locked, it wasn't isolation, that the student had the ability to ask to leave. And then the requirement that isolation and restraint be removed the moment the imminent threat of bodily harm is gone. Nobody seems to understand that. And students are held in these isolation spaces for hours. And they're also taken there because that's the third time you did something annoying in class. So now you're going to go in that space. So I see them being used inappropriately all the time, and families have no idea what their rights are. And they also have no idea that these emergency responses are separate from disciplinary actions. We have to do a lot of educating in that area. I hope that helps with your questions.
Thank you, Jerry. Maria Blauer from DC.
Okay, thank you so much for asking this question. We continue to see restraint and seclusion be overused, and we also really struggle. We don't I think gaslighting is very much the right word for it, but also just getting basic accountability, like a report that it even happened. The district doesn't have a citywide policy regarding restraint and seclusion. The District of Columbia's public schools has a 10-year-old restraint and seclusion policy that is not widely available. It's not published on their website. If you want to see it online, you have to get it from our office. We're the only place where it's published. So parents don't know about it. And they don't know that it's against the rules to restrain a child. And then half of the children in the city attend charter schools, and there's very much a mixed bag there. So it's not just the fact that it's happening, it's the fact that it's happening without rules, without tracking, without data, without a common set of definitions. And when it goes poorly, and it frequently does, the only redress most families have is the civil justice system or the criminal justice system. And because there aren't policies and rules and regulations in the district that cover this. So, that's not a good way to get help. Candidly, it's very hard to call, the District of Columbia's police, call MPD and say, my child was restrained at school today. Because that's the only place they can go. So thank you for the question, and I'm happy to talk more about it, but I feel like we have a two-part problem, a problem of a lack of infrastructure, and then it just happens way too much in addition to a lack of infrastructure.
Thank you, Maria. In the chat, Kelly Henderson from Virginia writes that guidance on how to align trauma-informed practices within IDEA, obligations and best practices for PBIS, FBAs, behavioral intervention plans, et cetera, would be very helpful to families and schools. And there's also more chat about come and pick your child up because he acted in class, and that's not considered a suspension, although the child is of course excluded. And then Sally Baker from Family Connection also writes that when seclusion methods are used, very rarely is there any support to help teach and reinforce the correct behavior afterwards. So there's a lot of conversation around that. But Mary Jacob from Louisiana, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Carmen, and thanks for this question. In Louisiana, we do have a state policy that is very specific, and it defines what restraint and seclusion is and what it isn't. And it gets down to the amount of minutes that a child has to be restrained, how they have to be restrained, the type of room they're in. Really does a really good job of defining what it is. Unfortunately, and then the districts are supposed to self-report when they do it. They're supposed to report not only to the family, but they're supposed to report to the state, and the state keeps a database with all of this in it. Unfortunately, most people don't ever report it to the state, and the state doesn't follow up or require any accountability with it. Some of our largest school systems that has 50,000 students in them are reporting they didn't have a single incident of restraint and seclusion. And we know that's not true because we know that we're getting the calls that's happening to kids. What's really scary to me is it's happening. The kids we know it's happening to are the ones that are verbal and can go home and say it's happening. I really worry that there's a lot of nonverbal children out there that are being restrained and secluded, and nobody knows that it's happening other than the people that's doing it to them.
Thank you, Mary. You bring up a good point, a very good point. Any other comments? Susan Henderson from DREDF.
Sorry, you'd asked about handcuffing of children, and I just wanted to, and you may have already heard that DREDF and Disability Rights California have sued Moreno Valley Unified School District down in the southern part of the state for handcuffing, and its sheriff's department, sheriff's deputies were called, they were part of the SRO, and for handcuffing an 11-year-old Black child with a disability a number of times over a 4-month period. Just want to put that on your radar.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Any other comments, or Dwayne, are there other questions that perhaps have not been addressed through the conversation?
No, I haven't. I think that the questions that I had have been addressed in addition to the ones that are listed. So.
Okay. There's a comment here from Connecticut. The Connecticut has the same restraints and seclusion situation. The infrastructure is there, to Mary's point. And it has improved things, but there's still ways around it when folks do not accurately self-report to the family or to the state. Yeah. And then Kiomari Sotillo from Connecticut, also from Connecticut, says, and add the thread, if you don't pick up your child, we will have to call the Department of Child and Families. Okay. Anybody else want to speak to any of those issues or something that has not been addressed or that you may have put in the chat that you would like to express verbally?
I would like to add, because I was going to put the last comment, that for families that are struggling and don't really have a good relationship with the school, when they have someone threaten to call DCF, it makes it even harder for the family to trust, especially if the family is working and they're undocumented, have limited income. The idea of being able just to get up and go because the child was not behaving, especially if there was an IEP and it was not being implemented as it was written, or there's ongoing behavioral issues and they haven't followed a process of maybe doing an FBA or making a referral to special education. It just makes it really hard for families to want to trust the school and send their kids to school. That's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Kiomari. And then Robin Kincaid, maybe you want to get off mute and ask the questions about if their states seeing restorative justice practices.
Hi, my name is Robin Kincaid. I'm from Nevada PEP, and our state has recently passed additional legislation encouraging school districts to use restorative justice practices. And I was just wondering if any of the centers had having that occurring in their state, and you know, what kind of progress maybe had been made in that area. Don't necessarily, obviously, positive behavioral supports and interventions is what schools should be using, but we're just wondering how that's going to fit in with any kind of restorative justice practices.
Thank you. So if anybody wants to respond to that either in the chat or directly, that would be great. And then Maria, would you like to respond to that?
I was going to say DC passed some legislation a few years ago that was citywide and really reshaped school discipline in the district. And I was really proud that we did that. And it brought a lot of our discipline rates way down. But it also meant that schools had to do alternatives to punitive discipline, and that included restorative justice. And I've seen really horrible, horrible things that are pretending to be restorative justice that aren't. So I think that one of the things that will probably, that I think a lot of, I've heard from other people who've experienced this has been like, there's got to be really robust quality control and really good education of families so that they know what restorative justice is supposed to look like. And it's supposed to be a cultural change and a community change. It's not supposed to be blaming and shaming. And I've been really surprised at some of the stuff that I've seen that schools are calling restorative justice when it's just not. So that's kind of a good thing and a bad thing, right? It's good that it's happening. It's good that kids are staying in school more a little bit, but maybe not so good that there's some stuff that is really not restorative justice that is going around giving restorative justice a bad name.
Thank you, Maria. Peg Kinsell from New Jersey.
Well, first, thanks so much for doing this. It's really been a great conversation. And I'm just here going, amen, hallelujah to everything that folks are saying, because they're all individually and collectively an important conversation. I couldn't agree more with Maria. What is the name of restorative justice? And especially for students with disabilities, can be shameful and definitely harmful. All the work that everyone's doing around social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices doesn't seem to include students with disabilities a lot of times. And as far as school resource officers being allowed to be the quote unquote disciplinarian is so inappropriate and so harmful. We see in New Jersey all the time issues around reporting or threatening to report to the police or Department of Children and Families around non-compliance of parents. So, I mean, we're seeing all that, and, you know, that we're even still talking about being allowed to restrain or, you know, lock kids up with disabilities in closets is abhorrent. So I'm really hoping that this conversation helps us really lift up and start to honor the civil rights and the trauma that we're inflicting on students with disabilities and special health care needs. But thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Peg. Mary Jacob?
Yes, Carmen, I did think about one other thing, because it's the beginning of the school year. We're already starting to get calls from parents that are trying to access before and after care. And they're being told that because their child has a disability, that they can't access it. And it's typically children with autism that has some behavior issues. We go through this every year, but this year we seem to be having more of them because of the lack of staffing that they have. And that's one of the things that they're using as a reason that we don't have enough staff to take. We have limits. We can only accept so many kids in it, and they're only taking kids that are kids without disabilities. So I think that's an issue that OCR definitely needs to have on their radar also.
Great. Thank you so much. We're at 3:59 and I don't see another hand raised. There was a question, there was some chat space here too about from Karen Thompson talking about how SROs, that if they're trained well, then they do a very good job. But if that training falters, that they go back to interpreting behavior as criminal rather than as a manifestation of a disability. So that's another important point to bring up. But with that, since we have 1 minute left, I just want to see if Dwayne has anything else he'd like to say, or if David Cantrell would like to close us out.
Thank you, Carmen. No, I didn't have anything else to say, except that I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in this call and conveying their thoughts and concerns. That the information that you've shared and the stories you have shared are very, very helpful as we go forward with thinking about how we're going to address discipline, how Office of Civil Rights will address discipline, particularly with students with disabilities. So thank you so much.
Great. And David?
Yeah, thank you, Carmen. So I echo Dwayne's comments. This conversation was very helpful to us. And I just can't thank all of you for your work. You know, the examples that you gave, it's really telling the challenges some of our parents are dealing with. So again, this was very helpful, and thank you all very much. Thanks.
And again, closing, I want to thank you. Please feel free to, if you would like to submit anything in writing, to submit it to me with a CC to your project officer if I'm not your project officer. And we will compile the written comments, the chat in the chat spaces, as well as this webinar, so that it can be used to inform folks about what you experience in the field. There's not adequate thanks for the work that you do, especially during this very difficult times with the pandemic and now in the start of the new school year. So have a wonderful rest of the day. And again, thank you all. Goodbye.